Great. Well, let's get started. Welcome. It is so nice to see so many familiar faces and so many new faces. I'm Heather Loughlin, president of the St. Croix Valley Foundation. And on behalf of the foundation and on behalf of our generous sponsor and partner, First State Bank and Trust, I am delighted to welcome you to our first ever virtual Conversations of the Valley. So to kick off today's program, I'm going to turn the screen briefly over to Sadiya, a Stillwater High School student. Now I'm going to warn you, Sadiya is a bit soft-spoken, so you may want to temporarily turn up the volume on your computer so that you don't miss anything of what she has to say.
My name is Farah. I'm 16. I go to Stillwater Area High School, and I used to live in Tennessee and then came up to Minnesota. I like reading and cooking.
And do you have siblings?
Yeah, I have 5 siblings. My ethnicity is Somali, so I'm really proud of that, and my race is Black. And the thing I like about both my ethnicity and my race is that the community is so put together, and most of us love and respect each other, and I feel like it's just one huge family, and we could relate our experiences together and talk to each other about everything we've been through and relate with each other, so it's nice. I've always grew up in a predominantly white space, especially down south. But my neighborhoods have always been majority Black or Somali, so I've only felt comfortable home and stuff. But when I go out and go to those predominantly white spaces, I expect to face some kind of microaggression or racism. Just be an ally. Look out for those people that you know could be at risk for those microaggressions or even blatant racism. Especially I know in my school there is a lot of blatant racism, and if there was just one white ally that could have been there for us, it would have felt 10 times better, and I wouldn't have to dread going there every single day. So just be an ally and look out for those that you know could be at risk. I find it comforting that people are starting to wake up. We're starting another movement where we can improve the lives of people that go through hard stuff every single day just for existing. And hopefully by the time we're older, we'll be okay and we'll get to live life comfortably and not be scared for our lives. I'm just super grateful to be here and for you guys to be giving us a place where we can talk, and hopefully this can become something bigger.
"25 years ago, a small group of passionate citizens got together and decided that we needed a community foundation right here in the St. Croix Valley, a foundation that would be focused on supporting our unique assets and our unique needs. From those conversations emerged the organization we now know as the St. Croix Valley Foundation. The mission of the St. Croix Valley Foundation is to enhance the quality of life in the St. Croix Valley. And we do this by encouraging and supporting charitable giving, by connecting people and programs, and by encouraging collaboration. One way that we encourage collaboration is through convenings, bringing together individuals and organizations to find solutions to shared community concerns. That is really what these conversations of the Valley are all about. Getting people together to learn, to talk, and to think about how we might respond together to some of the issues facing our region. Now, the theme of this year's Conversations of the Valley series is racial justice, listening, and learning. It took quite some time to land on that theme. After George Floyd's death on May 25th and hearing and seeing on television the ensuing demands for racial justice, I, like many of you, I'm guessing, wasn't quite sure how to respond. On one hand, this was all happening not so far from the Valley. Standing on the overpass in Hudson, you could actually see the skies glowing orange from the fire in Minneapolis. On the other hand, our mostly white communities sometimes seemed worlds away from all of this. Here in the Valley, where more and more families are having a hard time making ends meet, where small businesses are struggling in the face of COVID, where caregivers are struggling under the stress of caring for patients with COVID, aren't there more pressing topics than racism? It is with intention that we started today's Conversations of the Valley program with a video of Sadiya talking about her experience of race right here in the Valley. And as we move ahead with this year's series, we'll share more videos featuring other students whose stories we hope will help all of us deepen our understanding of how racism impacts people right here in our own Valley communities. I know not all of us come to this conversation with the same experiences, perspectives, or opinions, and that's a good thing. To really begin to address racism, we need to start with ourselves. We need to be willing to listen and to learn from others whose experiences are different than our own. That's our goal today. But before we introduce our speaker, a few words about the Zoom format for today's event. First, at the request of our speaker who wanted to be able to see all of your smiling faces, we are in a meeting format instead of the more traditional webinar format. To help keep things running smoothly, we have therefore muted all participants. Second, while we do suggest putting Zoom on speaker view so that the majority of your screen is filled with our speaker and his slides, you can also go to gallery view to scroll through and see all participants. Third, we will have time for questions at the end of our speaker's remarks. If you have questions for our speaker, please type them into the chat box. If you haven't used chat before, you should be able to access the chat icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Just click on chat and a box will pop up and you can type your question in. Finally, to give our speaker a sense for kind of where we are all at as we start this conversation, we ask that you take a moment to respond to the poll question that will appear on your screen. With the holidays approaching, what's your level of comfort with talking about race with your family members? Please just take a moment and let us know where your comfort level is with this topic. Give just another moment for folks to read through the options and respond, and then we'll share the results. Okay, well, as expected, some of us are more comfortable talking about race than others. I hope that today's program will help all of us feel just a bit more comfortable broaching what can be a tough topic. So finally, I am delighted to introduce today's speaker, Jason Jackson. Originally from much warmer Dallas, Texas, Jason has lived in Minneapolis since 2008. He has 2 degrees from the University of Minnesota, a master's in organizational leadership and policy development, and a bachelor's in communications studies. While at the U of M, Jason wrote curriculum on race and identity, taught courses in leadership studies, and served as the assistant director of the Gender and Sexuality Center for Queer and Trans Life. Jason then served as the director of the Lil Ted Suzuki Center in the Department of Multicultural Life at Macalester College, leaving that role in late 2019 to accept a position as an HR diversity and inclusion consultant at Health Partners. When Jason left Macalester, one of his colleagues had this to say about Jason. Jason has a particular gift of connecting with people. He was able to model in many ways the skill of being vulnerable and authentic, honest and supportive. He was willing to speak some truths. Jason, we are so delighted to have you here with us today to share some of your experiences and speak some truths as we launch this year's Conversations of the Valley series, Racial Justice, Listening and Learning. Welcome, Jason.
Wow, well, thank you so much for that, Heather. I was not expecting that quote. That was so sweet. I didn't even know, I'm trying to remember who said that, but that is so sweet. Thank you so much. Hi, sorry, I got all emotional about that. Jason, Jackson, thank you all for having me. I really am excited to be here to have this conversation with you all. Conversations in the Valley Foundation, Heather, thank you. And also Angie and Ellen for all of your support getting this conversation started. In my heart of hearts, like you mentioned, Heather, I would love to see you all in person. I make the joke I do better in person sometimes, but in the current times we're in, we're using this framework. And if I had it my way, I would get a chance to learn a little bit more about each and every one of you as we do some more digging in terms of talking about race, racism, and anti-racism in our worlds. And as I was reading through the chat, I also noticed so many, the diversity really in terms of where you all are kind of coming from in, either your work or your communities. And so my goal today will be to speak to more of a broad kind of way of looking at anti-racism and racism, right? So from family to community to work and institutions, I'm going to try my hardest to kind of frame it in those terms. And so, yeah, I'm excited to be here. I'm going to stop gawking at you and get started. So you can put up the slides, I think. Nice. So the bio was great, so I'm not going to talk about myself anymore, but I will say this last thing, which is that as I'm doing this work with you all, it is really, really important to note that I'm also doing this work myself every single day and really trying to kind of figure out what my role is, even though I live on these intersections of being identifying as Black and gay in the United States, I still have an obligation to do work that kind of lifts the oppression of anybody around me, right? Regardless of whether I identify as a man, but my work is still important to think about how gender impacts those who are most marginalized by gender. So trans people, women, et cetera. So, but setting the stage, this title of this presentation today is Identifying Racism, Identifying, Resisting, and Responding to Racism. But there is a caveat, though, to the title, because one of the things is we want to really kind of steer away from the responding piece and to be a little bit more proactive in terms of addressing race and racism as it comes up. So I want to make sure I'm noting that piece about being proactive as well. And I think that this presentation will lend itself to kind of helping with that. So as I frame and set the stage for you, I'm just going to read this little short description that came with you for the presentation. And in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, in the hands of law enforcement, individuals and organizations are being held to a newer and stronger standard to be accountable for identifying, resisting, responding, and addressing racism. racism, specifically anti-Blackness, right, which dates back centuries, but the effects are felt and experienced to this day. As you saw with the youth Sadiya in the video, and she talked a lot about, I almost expect to experience microaggressions and different forms of discrimination when I walk into a particular environment. And to hear that, as an older person of color and from a younger person of color breaks my heart, but, it's nothing particularly new. So in this session, we'll examine the impacts of that systemic racism in the United States, and the part that we play in maintaining it and our responsibility for dismantling racism, all right? But I have to also give you some context. And I was reminded in a presentation recently, this context is so important. If you wanna go ahead and click the next one, perfect. And that image there you see, what are we dealing with and where are we? And we're gonna look at the United States first and foremost, right? And you think about the history that we've existed and lived in. And you think about enslavement, right? The selling and trading and degradation of an entire group of people in our country lasted, definitely before 1640. I want to say 1619 is when we can document one of the very first people who were transported as cargo to what we now know as, the United States. Up until now, so we're talking about 400 years of degradation, not being seen as a human being, right? Then we move into the mid 19th century. You have the Civil War, 1816. You have Reconstruction, you have Jim Crow. So we have about 100 years of separate but equal, right? And we know from history that we talk about particularly Black and brown people, and often people of color as well in the United States, it was definitely very separate, but unequal is maybe more so the term that we've seen. We can see these things play out in schools. We see unequal treatment and fairness in terms of policing, in terms of certain neighborhoods, et cetera. So that was about a chunk of about 100 years, 26%. And now we are in post-civil rights, right? Post legislation in the 1960s. So about 47 years into more kind of stronger laws that kind of changed the way in which I think Black people in the United States were engaging with civil rights. The reality of it, though, is that that policy does not always equal practice, right? We may have policies on the books, but discrimination still exists in practices. So as we think about trying to kind of move through the understanding of racism in the United States, we have to really, I think, remember that we're still really new at it, right? And we have a long history of it. And we have to take that into consideration. We're not going to end racism on this, 1 hour call today. We're not going to, make things completely right with history, but we do have a responsibility to chip away, I believe, at a lot of this stuff. So in context of the larger story of history of racism, we are still relatively new in this work. So the next slide. I want you to keep in mind a few things, which I think are going to be critical to the conversation. I want you to feel like you can jump in, ask questions. I'll do my best to address questions that pop up in the chat as I'm able to. I want you to keep in mind a few things. Politeness, right? I've often been told, and heard the phrase, I wish we could just be nice to each other. I wish we could be more polite with each other. And I could not agree more. But in the reality of things, right, we are still navigating a lot of anxieties and stress, especially right now, as Heather, you mentioned the uprising in the Twin Cities after the murder of George Floyd. But we also have to remember that our stories and our experiences are very different, and how we understand politeness will show up very differently. Here's a great example. We have somebody working on our garage, and great guy. We had a mini conversation, but he mentioned in this neighborhood that I live in, it used to be really, really bad, and now it's better. And I want to ask what that meant. And I think for him, he didn't want to say it explicitly, but for him, it did mean people of color and also crime. But then he decided to kind of move on from the conversation because he wanted to keep things light. The reality of it is that sometimes it's not going to always feel polite to talk about race and racism. Race and racism in our country isn't a polite story. It's just not. But it's important, I do think, to address it. Also, to critique is another one I want you to keep in mind as well. I may say things like, in the United States, we have had a history of oppression, or I may critique, an organization. To critique something is not the same as to hate something, right? So what I mean by that is when we critique things, we usually care about it, right? We care about bringing a perspective to say, this is a problem in this organization, we need to do better, right? This isn't always a critique about this organization is awful, down with it, right? It's more about how do we change? And so to critique is to really, I think, ask the questions about what is wrong so that we can start to address what is right and how do we get there. And the answer, like I keep mentioning it and I'll probably continue to mention it. Oftentimes people want the answer to how do I end racism? How do I end it like yesterday? And I wish we could. I wish I had the answer, right? But I don't. And if you go back to like that little image that we saw earlier, we've had a long history of racism in this country, and it will probably take just as long to undo some of the things. And so as we, when George Floyd was murdered and I came back to work, the anxiety of like, what do I do? What do I do? And people kept looking for like this magic bullet, for lack of better terms. But what we can start to do is not like just look for the answer, but understand where our own biases show up. What are the things that we're still holding on to? What are the conversations that we're having with our communities? And we won't probably see, again, the end of racism in our time. We won't see it, but we have a responsibility to chip away at it. So what I want to do is give you some context in terms of how this thing of race and racism is operating in our general kind of culture and how it connects to us on an individual basis as well. So you see here a lot going on. I'm going to just go ahead and define briefly these two terms at the very bottom, race and racism. So race, which refers to the categories in which we, as a society, artificially place individuals on the basis of physical characteristics such as skin color, hair type, facial form, and eye shape, if I didn't already say that. So though many believe that race is determined by biology, it is now widely accepted more so that it is more of a classification, right? An arbitrary classification, which means that there is literally no biological difference between anybody in terms of their race, right? We kind of operate in the same kind of ways, physiologically, biologically. Our experiences, however, right, may be very different. But in terms of race, there's no basis where race, me being a Black person versus somebody being white, that somebody's inherently stronger, better, et cetera. We made those things up, right? We made them mean something. And then racism. Racism, one who is a racist, therefore, is someone who supports this hierarchy, this like created way of like somebody is better than the other. When you support those notions, right, through either your thoughts, through your actions, or even your inactions, that is what racism and one will call a racist would essentially be, someone who supports that. Now let's look at this on like the bigger scale in terms of how oppression operates from an individual level to structural, right? So individual meaning the things that like I may say or do, or things that I value. So individually on this big concentric circle here, if we start on the left, an individual, assumptions, my bias, my thoughts, I think that you're better than this person. These are things that I'm holding on to, these biases. And these biases were created through experiences that we've had, and also with our families, likely the things that they tell us, the things we see in the media, they reinforce them, right? These ideas that starts to form. And then we move from individuals to interpersonal, right? This is when you start talking to other people. It sounds really like simple, but you start talking about people, and then sometimes those perspectives that you have, either they mesh with someone else or there's a clash, right? So my values around I value direct communication. It may not align with, say, Mahalia and values of a family who have a very different way of communicating, right? The interactions between people, both within and across difference. Then we move into how we start to apply them in terms of institutions. So for example, if I and another person all interpersonally think very similarly, and we may also have some power, we have the ability to create policies around hiring, firing, discipline, et cetera, in our educational systems, et cetera. If I have the power to implement a policy and a structure in my, like, say, school, that is where institutional race or racism may start to show up, all right? I think about policies like, when you may read a policy around like a dress code, you may think of something like, all colleagues or all staff members must have their hair tamed, maintained, and pulled back. So I think about these terms like tame and maintained. And I think about, somebody whose hair may be frizzier, somebody whose hair may be in dreadlocks, somebody's hair that may be kind of blown out more. How might that policy be used as a tool to discriminate, either intentionally or unintentionally, to someone who's a person of color, right? And then structurally. So structural is, so I take the schools, going from institutional, where there's a school and an institution, and it connects to other institutions, right? And so it starts to connect. So policies in terms of incarceration rates, immigration policies, access to education, that's where we start to see how systems are starting to connect that make it very difficult for people to kind of navigate through, right? So that's what that is showing. Now, if you hit the next slide, let me just give you, I think, one of the best ways I've been, the next slide for me too, I'm sorry. Right after that one. I'm giving you the way that it was taught to me, or one of the quotes actually that I find to be a great connector. From a book called So You Want to Talk About Race, by Ijoma Olu, 2018. And in this book, she says, no, the problem isn't that just a white person, individual, may think that Black people are lazy and that hurts Black people's feelings. It is that the belief that Black people are lazy reinforces and reinforced by a general dialogue interpersonal that believes the same, and then uses that belief to justify not hiring Black people for jobs, right? So a particular job in an institution, and denying Black people housing and discriminating against Black people in schools, so structurally, right? So that quote pretty much, I think, does a really great job of connecting the dots in terms of, again, you may not intend to be a racist person or homophobic person, but the things that we say and the things that we do have a direct impact to structural inequalities, right? And I think that this quote in many ways kind of like connects it in a nice package. If you move on to the next slide. In order, I think, to do a lot of this work, I think that we also do have to take a moment and understand the impacts of privilege, right? And how privilege shows up. I'm going to define privilege in a more general sense here. So I think there's like some like blocks on, are you seeing that? On the screen? I'll just see if I can just move through. So
yeah, sorry, Jason. It's the cursor on our side, and we are trying to get it to go away. But
you're all good.
Yeah.
Thank you. And so then privilege. Privilege is unearned advantages, immunity, and social power held by members of a dominant group. All right. So privilege. So for me, if I just take the idea around gender, I have unearned advantages that I get. When I apply for my jobs, I usually don't really think too much about pay, really. I mean, I do think about pay. I love money. I'm not going to apologize about that. But I don't think that I am going to get less pay because of my gender. I don't. Where a lot of my friends who identify as women say they have to constantly negotiate that. They're thinking that maybe they're not going to get the pay equity or pay that for doing the same work that maybe I would do. That's something that they're holding on to and navigating, because statistically, in this country, we do know that women make significantly less money than men for doing the same job, right? So an unearned privilege or unearned advantage I get is to not worry about that. I will likely have my money, and I don't have to hold on to some of that anxiety, right? Frame me up to do a lot of other things. White privilege, I think it's really important to understand that if we take the context of privilege and attitude to be white around race, it's important to understand it is complex and it is layered, right? So you can definitely be privileged due to one identity like race, but also be disadvantaged by another like gender. So to be particularly a white woman. However, we want to make sure that we're going to be focusing our conversations today mostly here and centering it around race and how race shows up. Privilege is also a result of systemic oppression, right? It is not, your fault you got it, but you have it, right? And then it is a social privilege that affects people in every aspect of your life. So when you think about what does it mean to go into certain spaces and certain grocery stores, et cetera, and you're not being watched, right? All the way up to, again, going back to like applying for a job and having access. It affects us from like the conversations we have with people, how people view us. Privilege does not mean that those who have it should stop talking or engaging in conversations about race. In fact, it's quite the contrary. I believe that if you have privilege, you have to be a part of the conversation. You have to be able to, I think, do two things. One is use that privilege. If you have the space, mental space freed up from holding or having privilege, if you also know that because of maybe your gender, your race in particular, gives you a certain level of like power in a certain situation, leverage that power for those who may not socially have it, right? And also, you may have heard people say things like, check your privilege. And checking your privilege does not necessarily mean stop talking, go away. What that does mean is to reflect on what you have and understand how to better use it, right? So I do think that people who have privilege, and particularly white privilege, it's almost essential and critical that you're a part of the conversations with us. So thinking about the Valley, knowing that there may not be a lot of particularly people of color in that, in the communities of the Valley and St. Croix, you still play a big part in undoing racism because you have a race and you benefit from it. And then the last point I want to make sure I made here was, doesn't mean that you have not struggled or worked hard for what you have. It's just that you don't have to necessarily worry that because of who you are, you're being cheated out of something or being held to a different like standard, right? So again, privilege is not something to be ashamed of. It's not something to apologize for, but it is a tool, I do think, to use. And if we look back in history, we talked about enslavement, we talked about separate but equal and civil rights movement, we needed people with privilege, white people, to be a part of that work right along with us, right, to undo some of that. So what I'm gonna do is do a little quick exercise with you all, if I could. And what I want you to do in a second, I'm gonna put up about 10 statements. And when I put these statements up, what I would like for you to do is I want you to, on your own, some personal notes, if you have a piece of paper to write on or something, I want you to write one and kind of do like a tally mark maybe. So one, if the statement is often true for you. And then I want you to indicate a 0 if the statement is seldom or never really true for you. Unfortunately, there's no middle ground I'm going to offer you here, right? And so again, as I start to read these off, I want you to just kind of write 1 again, if it is true for you, 0 if it is not. And I want you to add those numbers up. I don't want you to necessarily share them in the chat in particular, but I want us to reflect on it. Are you ready? All right. Number 1, I can go shopping alone most of the time. pretty well assured that I will not be followed or harassed. I can be pretty sure that my neighbors in such a location will be neutral or pleasant to me. And again, if you can, you don't necessarily have to, again, put your points inside of the chat. The third one, I can easily buy posters, postcards, greeting cards, dolls, toys, and children's books featuring people of my own race. I can be pretty sure that if I ask to talk to the quote unquote person in charge, I will be facing a person of my own race. I am never asked to speak for all the people of my racial group. I can swear or dress in secondhand clothes or not answer letters without having people attribute these choices to the bad morals, the poverty, or illiteracy of my race. I can arrange to protect my children most of the time from people who might not like them. Whether I use checks, credit cards, or cash, I can count on my skin color not to work against the appearance of financial reliability. And the last question, I can be sure that my children will be given curricular materials that testify to the existence of their race. And the last one is I can do well in a challenging situation without it being called a credit to my race. Just give us a moment. And I want you to feel free to, add up all of the total of what you were marking down. I'm going to sit with it for a second here. All right. Feel free to start putting some things in the chat box for me, not necessarily your numbers, but I want to know just briefly kind of what that was like for you, right? Any like aha moments or anything that kind of just showed up for you as you were reading through that, something that maybe you never even thought about before. Holy crap, I am privileged. I'm sorry. And I have done before, and yes, I am a white person with a score of 10. My extreme privilege, I have done this activity before. It is very striking every time. How much unearned privilege I am privileged. Having my success being considered a credit to my race, hadn't really thought about that, right? Yeah, and I'm gonna just really quickly speak to the piece about, what was it? It was the one about being a credit to my race, right? Oftentimes when, something really negative happens, say particularly for like a Black person, say there's like a robbery that may happen, and I'm in the room full of white people and having a conversation, immediately, right, I can even feel or sense eyes looking at me to like either respond to it. And even internally, I often feel very much like personally like, oh, why do they have to be Black, right? Because I do know that oftentimes things that happen in terms of, violence, et cetera, it always feels like a personal thing to me and another way for people to use that against me, right? That may not be the case, particularly for white people. When I was growing up, I remember being in at the airport as a young kid, and I remember I just noticed something really strange. When I would see mostly white people at the airport, you would see like a varied degree of how people would dress. But most of the times I see people who they look really comfortable, white people look really comfortable, sweats on, they're getting on an airplane for 2 or 3 hours. But I will often find that from my experience, Black people seem to dress up, right? And I was always really curious to know what that was all about. And, you know, my mother taught me that we have to present oftentimes ourselves to be seen as important, unfortunately, right? We don't have to, but it seems like we do, right? Where, you know, you may have more room, more space if you don't have that privilege to do so. And that was a lesson I learned as a young child. I don't agree with it, I don't think it's right, but it is part of the culture. It's part of this arbitrary way in which we've understood race and racism. Scary that I never thought about it in this way before. There is white privilege for you. Yes, so again, this is just a tool, again, for us just to do some more reflection. And as we talk about what does it mean to do this work, I think it is so critical for us to do some reflection on terms of what are maybe things that my friends' children who may be people of color are teaching their children about race that I'm not. Recently, someone mentioned to me, a white colleague, they were like, you know, I want to really talk to my children, you know, about race and racism and the uprisings that have been happening, but I don't want to scare them, right? I don't want to do too much too quickly. And then I remember sharing with her, I was like, you know, we all want to protect our children, make sure that they're safe. On the other end, think about the safety for children of color who will likely experience racism raw and real without a safety net involved. So I would really err on the side of you go ahead and just having the conversation. It's going to feel stingy with your white children 100%. Because on the other hand, what's going to happen is that the young people of color will experience it no matter what. And there won't always be a safety net to feel good about it. Like with, again, the young woman in the video, Sadiya, talked about, she's experiencing it probably constantly in a mostly white environment. So what do we do with all of this? All right, what do we do with the predicament that we find ourselves in this time? Anti-racism is a term, I believe, that we have been hearing more and more recently. I can't tell you right now where the term was like officially coined, but the book, How to Be an Anti-Racist by Dr. Ibram Kendi came out a few years ago. But it wasn't until after the murder of George Floyd that we started to really like grapple with this concept of like undoing some of the things that we have been doing, racist acts and what they mean. So at Health Partners, I've been really working with our team to really think about how do we define anti-racism? What does it look like? What does it sound like? So here's a great definition that we're starting to kind of incorporate over at Health Partners, and I really, really appreciate it. Anti-racism is the active and ongoing process of identifying and eliminating racism by changing systems and organizations and structures and policies. It's a whole laundry list of things, and attitudes, so that power is redistributed and shared equitably. To be anti-racist requires us to acknowledge the persistence of racism through our organizations and our industries and our communities, our families, neighbors, and to recognize that racism is a system of disproportionate opportunity and penalties based on skin color. Right? It forces you to really understand the biggest piece, which is that it is ongoing and it is active, meaning that, again, there's no magic bullet, no magic tool. 15-minute point, thank you. So I wanted to also take a hot minute as we think about doing this work around anti-racism to understand maybe where you may find yourself falling into, or what kind of like area of anti-racism, what it might look like. Just see really quickly. There's these 3 different zones. This was also kind of came out at the same time as Dr. Ibram Kendi's book. The different like levels of zones that we have to go through in order to start to shift our perspectives and start doing the work of anti-racism. We don't do the work of anti-racism when we're in the zone of fear, right? So I avoid questions, I deny racism as a problem, I strive to be comfortable. One thing about this becoming an anti-racism visual is that it's going to look and feel very different for people of color, right? So for example, I avoid questions. I avoid hard questions, and I deny racism as a problem. If I, Jason Jackson, as a Black person, were to say that, my fear usually is about being exhausted. I don't want to talk about racism, right? I don't want to answer the questions. I'm exhausted. I've experienced it so much this week. I'm tired. For those who identify as white and to have privilege, right? You may not have had all of the cumulative like baggage of navigating racism, but the question of fear is why or where the fear is coming from. Why avoiding the hard questions, right? Oftentimes, I think that we avoid hard questions and deny the issues around racism is because we are afraid of saying the wrong things, right? We are afraid of rocking the boat too much. And we're also afraid of discomfort, right? The learning zone, moving into like learning zone, these are more things like you seeking, asking questions, and pretty much putting yourself out there a little bit more and taking bigger risk. So for example, I seek out questions that make me uncomfortable. Doesn't feel good, doesn't feel great, but learning doesn't always feel great either. When we're being challenged to undo or rethink something that we've thought before previously, to be corrected or to have to readjust is uncomfortable or can be really uncomfortable. But it can also be one of the most critical things that we could do. I listen to others who think and look different than me, right? So that's moving out of your comfort zones, connecting with maybe other people of color, having conversations, etc. Then the growth zone, right? I sit with my discomfort. I promote and advocate for policies and leaders that are anti-racist, educate my peers on how racism harms our profession or our institutions, right? So that is the part again where you are doing more active work, right? You are speaking out louder, you are acknowledging certain things. So I want you to really start doing some reflection on kind of where you may find yourself kind of being positioned a lot of times, what happens, and maybe like the question of why. I feel like I'm running out of some time, so I'm gonna skip a few pieces. I can make sure that these are shared with you. But I want us move from the individual anti-racism actions to the more collective ones. If you can hit the next slide. In blue, the anti-racism in action collective and at work. These are some things I've been really thinking through a lot lately. What might it look like? Know your own resources, privileges, and sphere of influences. This also falls in the same category as individual. Know who you are, know where you sit, thinking about at work, whose ear do you have, right? And what privileges do you have? You have to really, really assess, I think, some of those things in order to decide on kind of how to move and where to move. A few other things, again, I can't stress this enough, the acknowledgement of the existence of racism. Now, why that is important is because, again, say, for example, for a white person, it may be difficult for you to acknowledge the existence of racism if you are not on the receiving end of it. However, when we hear our community members talking, people of color talking about their experiences with racism, even at best, just validating those experiences at best, right? I think it's really, really critical. But in order to navigate something, in order to work to treat something, we have to diagnose it, speaking in like the health terms. Leaders must avoid being defensive about experiences that challenges their worldviews. Equity efforts in the workplace report directly to CEOs rather than human resource executives. These are conversations we're having right now in our institution, meaning that, you know, oftentimes like diversity and inclusion work and doing anti-racism work in schools or other businesses and organizations, they're situated in like little small pocket areas, and they're not always being floated to the very top where like decisions are really being made quickly for a larger pool of people. So having a person who's doing the work of diversity, inclusion, or anti-racism, it must be at like the leader level as well. We have to be innovative, right? Because we've done things the same in terms of how we structure meetings, how we look at policy, we have to be able to be a little bit more innovative in what that looks like. Having employees engage, employee resource groups, having employees engage colleagues and or students, having spaces for them to engage, I think is really critical to this work. Trainings like we're doing now, or presentations, the more we learn. I know many of you talked about you've done the privilege exercise in the past, but many of you said that you continue to learn something new. That's what that's always about, right? The more education that we can provide to our community members, neighbors, et cetera, the better. And also, what are your goals? What are you trying to do, right? Are we trying to increase the number of minoritized people in a particular school district or staff or community or neighborhood? And if that's the case, then how are you measuring that, right? How do you know that you're actually being successful in some of that work? Policy review, regardless of whatever industry or institution you're in, you have to take a look at policies that are maybe unintentionally impacting those on the margins. I used the examples earlier about like hairstyle and code of conduct, et cetera. And then last, but definitely not least, we have to take risk. We have to put ourselves out there and practice this work in public. I often encourage people who are white and may have a title of like leader or leadership to open up a dialogue with your team members, right? And they always say, well, what if I say the wrong things? And what if I do? You probably will do the wrong things, right? But you're not going to blow up. You'll probably learn and you'll be better next time, right? It's like working a muscle. We have to practice, but we have to also do it in public where people can help us be more accountable to ourselves and to the work. I'm gonna stop right there because actually, you know what? I'm lying. I'm not going to stop. You have this this next slide. You have this in your as another tool for you to be able to use to situate yourself and think about what are things that what are possible for you to do. Start today, right? What's possible for you to do today? What's possible for you to do next week, remainder of the year? The question about what gets in the way of you following through on your commitments, going back to that, like becoming an anti-racist model, where does the fear come from, right? What is the anxiety maybe around being perfect or doing it right? Is that getting in the way of you moving forward to creating change? And then last but not least, accountability. We have to have people around us or something that keeps us accountable to doing it. Because again, as a Black person in this country, I will say that, you know, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, these are not the first, you know, young people who have been killed and murdered and reported on. But what I have experienced is that sometimes these murders and these tragic situations are happening and we move on to something different, right? Now is the time that we hold ourselves accountable to consistently addressing anti-racism in our spheres of influence, but not just when another person is killed or harassed or not offered a job or a home, but almost every day, we begin to like the everyday fabric of the work that we do. Now I'm gonna stop. Oh my God, how bad am I on time?
No, you know what? We're fine. We're fine. And you have done a great job. I can tell you've been, I don't know how you do it, but you kept talking while you were reading the chat because you've been incorporating responses to some of the questions as you've gone along, Jason. Someone did ask about your slides and whether they would be available. And I believe the answer is yes. So we are gonna, everyone on the call will get an email with a link to a brief survey. But in that, which we hope you will respond to because it helps us plan better and better events. But in that email will also be a link to information from today's presentation. So a recording of the presentation, a deck from the presentation. I also know that what lots of us are missing is the conversation at the table after the presentation. So there, we worked with Jason and we'll have a link to a couple of prompting questions. So I know I've already heard from a few of you who are planning to, with a group of friends or with your local community foundation, get together and have kind of like an after the presentation conversation. So we'll have some questions there. So we hope that despite the fact that we are running out of time, that you will continue this conversation. I think, you know, Jason, I really appreciated that that 3 spherical graphic of becoming an anti-racist. you know, the theme of this series is listening and learning. And when we listened to the video at the beginning with that young woman from Stillwater, and she says, you know, when asked what could we do, and she says, be an ally. And for a lot of us, we're not quite sure what that means. I think what I'm hearing from today's presentation is being nice is good, but being nice isn't enough. That you need to be thinking about how you can be more proactive. And I think a lot of us are in that learning zone. And that's really what this series is about, this listening and learning. It's how do we move into that learning zone? And then for some of us, we're gonna wanna push further and push into that growth zone and really think about kind of how can we do more? Does it make sense for us to be thinking about doing more? But tying that model to those opening remarks from that young woman about how can you be an ally was super helpful. Any final comment, Jason? I know you're scrolling the comments right now. Any final remark before we close? I want to be respectful of everyone's time.
Great. Thank you so much for that. I see so many amazing comments too that I could even like get to, but I will say this, you know, particularly there was a mention about how, you know, the privilege exercise could be very difficult for people of color. And you're absolutely right. And I've had people in rooms with me who are like, people of color who are saying I'm struggling. And what I have to say is, yeah, you are going to struggle in these exercises and some of this work because we live in this world, right? And there's unfortunately no escaping it. We have to address it. So if you're a facilitator and you're going to be doing a privilege exercise like this, it is so critical to address that and name those things up front, how this may impact certain communities in a very different way. For the Valley and for communities in the Valley, you know, again, I just cannot stress the importance enough of having conversations with your community members, right? You may not be able to write the next anti-racist legislation for like the country, but what you can be doing is, Sadiya mentioned, is to be an ally, is you have conversations with your neighbors, with your family members. You are really dropping little like droplets in the bucket of change, right? And not everybody's gonna walk away from your conversations saying or thinking like, yes, I am so enlightened, right? That's not gonna happen. What will happen is people will go back and they'll think, and they may be mad at you or frustrated. And if those risks are hard, I want you to remember this. If the risk of telling your supervisor that there's a racist issue happening, or your neighbor that like, I don't condone hate and I wish you wouldn't either, think about the flip side, right? The experiences of people who are on the target of that, and what the other quote unquote people of color have to navigate and deal with that. If they can survive this long in this world, which is not right, you can survive a heavy conversation with your grandparent, with your best friend, with your next door neighbor, with your supervisor. You can do this, and you're probably already doing it, all right? Thank you so much for having me, and I hope this was somewhat like helpful to move us through.
Thank you,
I'll do some
Jason. Thanks.
podcast recommendations too later, yes.
Thank you so much for your time today. Thank you all of you for joining us, for making time for this important work. Thanks again to our partner, First State Bank and Trust. I hope you all will plan to join us on Wednesday, January 20th, our next Conversations of the Valley event. We'll have Dr. Bill Green with us. He's a professor at Augsburg University, and he's going to be looking specifically in our region about historically what has happened in this region to create the disparities that Black Americans here continue to experience today. So I hope you'll join us then. If you're new to these events and to the work of the St. Croix Valley Foundation and would like to learn more, I hope you'll visit our website, scvfoundation.org, or give us a call. And of course, I have to say this as we're nearing year end, as you're making plans for your own year end charitable giving, please know that we are always happy to talk with you about how we might partner with you to help you take care of the organizations, causes, and communities that you love. I'd welcome the opportunity to sit down with you via Zoom, of course, for now, to learn more about your goals and how we might partner with you. So thank you again for joining us today. Be safe, be well, and I hope we'll see you next time.
Bye.
Thank you, Jason.
Thank you.